Hey everyone, in today's show, I have a great guest joining me, Jason Barrett. He is an attorney who will be shedding light on a very important compliance topic, data privacy. Jason is going to talk about some new state laws that HR needs to know about regarding data privacy, and we're going to discuss some best practices for employers on how to avoid liability for data breaches.
Welcome to the HR Investigations Podcast, exploring the issues, challenges, strategies, and solutions. Sponsored by RPCHR and hosted by Natalie Ivy, an HR consultant, licensed PI, and author of the best-selling book, How to Conduct Internal Investigations, a practical guide for human resource professionals. And now, here's Natalie.
Hey everybody, this is Natalie Ivy, and welcome to the HR Investigations Podcast. I'm really excited about today's show because I have a great guest that is joining me today, Jason Barrett. And Jason is an attorney and someone that I've come to learn has quite a level of expertise in not only the legal profession, but also in human resource management. And so I'm excited to have him join us today. And the topic for today's show is Spotlight on data privacy and why it matters to HR professionals. So at this point, what I'd like to do is I'm going to turn it over to you, Jason, and if you can share with our listening audience just a little bit about you, your career bio, and then we'll get into talking some shop.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Natalie, for having me here today. I've truly enjoyed listening to your podcast and think the information that you provide is very helpful for both legal and HR practitioners. So a little bit about my background. I've spent over 20 years in corporate legal, compliance, and HR roles in various industries. My focus areas have been in global employment and labor law and employee relations and data privacy compliance. And I've also worked to manage IP matters, including trade secrets, trademarks, and patent portfolios. So in late 2022, I decided to leave the corporate world and start my own business, fractional legal and HR consulting firm called Jane Consulting. And Jane is focused on some of those same areas that I mentioned earlier, providing comprehensive HR, legal, and data privacy consulting advice and training. My client base is public, private, nonprofit companies. And in my prior roles, I've also, and with Jane Consulting, I've also been involved in developing and implementing global data privacy programs and doing quite a few HR investigations for employers. And so a lot of the topics that you've covered in the past really resonate with me. And again, very, very happy to be here.
Oh, terrific. Thanks very much. And I told you to my listening audience, he's an expert. All right. So now, before we get into some real specifics, at a high level here, can you really share with the group, really, what is this data privacy thing about? And why is this a topic that HR professionals really need to know about, Jason?
So it's a great question, and I'm glad we're kind of starting there because, as you might imagine, data privacy is quite broad in terms of a topic, and there's many different topics that could be covered under that umbrella for HR practitioners. And what I think is really important for them to know is that there are a growing number of data privacy laws and regulations that apply to employers as to how they collect, process, and store personal or employee data. We're all familiar with some of the laws that HR has been managing in the past, things like HIPAA, things like some of the financial laws as it relates to data privacy. But these laws that are coming into fruition now are more overarching in nature. They really follow the model of the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which is the model out of the EU, that is much more overarching, and it's much more focused on the types of personal or employee data that employers and HR folks in particular are typically managing on a day-to-day basis. And so now there's 15 and growing in terms of the number of states that have these kinds of laws on the books.
Oh.
And they are very prescriptive in terms of what employers need to be doing and some of the notifications that employees need to be made aware of.
Ah, terrific. And with that, I know one of the states is Texas. And so at RPC, we definitely do a lot of business in Texas. We've got a pretty big presence in Houston and Dallas. So for our listeners, would you talk about the new law in Texas?
Absolutely. So it was quite interesting to me, as having practiced in Texas for many years, that Texas went the way that it did. It's actually quite a prescriptive law. It was passed in June of 2023. and it goes into effect in full force in July of 2024. So it's just right around the corner. Just from a high level standpoint, the Texas law applies to companies that are, of course, conducting business in Texas or producing any products or services that are consumed by Texas residents. What's an interesting nuance in terms of the Texas law, many of the state laws sort of follow that European model that I mentioned earlier, that are focused primarily on organizations that have consumer data. These U.S. state laws, including the Texas law, and the Texas law is a little unique in that it focuses on organizations that sell or process personal data. And so process is a very, very broadly defined term. When you think of it from an employer and HR perspective, anything that you touch in terms of employee data, whether it's the application process where you're receiving someone's personal information as part of that application process, whether it's during the life cycle of employment, helping to manage payroll, benefits, anything along those lines, it's going to fall within the definition of processing because of how broadly it's defined in these laws. What's also unique about the Texas laws, there are no revenue thresholds. Many of the state laws actually have revenue thresholds. There's no revenue thresholds. It really comes to pass or comes into effect if you're one of those companies that I mentioned earlier that is conducting business in Texas, or if you are producing products or services. I'll stop there because I let people digest a little bit. And then there's certain notification requirements and exemptions, of course, that we could talk about as well. But that's just sort of the overarching kind of high level summary.
So with that said, all employers, or is there a headcount threshold? So does this apply to small businesses, let's say fewer than 100 or 50 employees?
The Texas law follows the Small Business Association definition. So generally any companies under 500 employees would be exempt as of now. Nonprofits are exempt the way the law is drafted currently. And as you might imagine, and thankfully this is the case, the law also exempts organizations that are already maintaining data or covering data that are covered by laws like HIPAA, like the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And there's other laws that are mentioned that provide for exemptions for this law, so that there's not overlapping or duplication, I guess I should say, in terms of this law, state law versus some of the federal laws that are out there. And there is also an exclusion for one type of data that I think a lot of companies, would be interested in, and that is for any data that's collected exclusively for the purpose of commercial or in an employment context. Okay. So you might say as an HR practitioner, well, look, I don't need to worry about this, right? Because we're only collecting this data for the purpose of HR administration, and therefore we should be exempt. Fair, except that the way that employment context, there's really no definition around that. You might imagine that someone collects data as an organization for purposes of a job application or managing benefits or what have you. What if the organization then uses that same data? They might need that data for other purposes. Maybe you have a relationship with an insurance provider that could provide some kind of a lump sum discount to your employees. Well, is that truly within the employment context, or could that be outside of the employment context?
I see.
And similarly, if you have certain relationship with third party that help you manage certain aspects of your business, and by nature of those relationships, you need to provide that information on your employees to those third parties. I can envision many different ways in which the employment context is sort of diluted as it relates to what otherwise might be exempt of an exemption in these laws.
Okay, so we definitely know that this is something that is a little bit of a 500 and up employee headcount type of issue. So therefore, our smaller businesses, you kind of dodged it on this one. However, that doesn't mean that we don't need to take data privacy seriously. But from the standpoint of, having to comply with some of the different state statutes, this is more of a larger entity. But, key point, those of you who are in the listening audience that are with global organizations and you have responsibility for managing, let's say, in the EU, this would be very important for you to have an understanding of what goes on with data privacy in the EU, because it's very different in the way that they're handling things there than in the States. So Let's talk about some of the key takeaways for employers and HR teams. So maybe share a few bullet points here, takeaways, things that you think are really important that HR professionals should walk away from our podcast today with some tasks that maybe they want to employ.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you asked, because when I speak on this point to different associations and organizations, that's typically a question that comes up. Okay, this is overwhelming. Just give me some of the key takeaways, right? So let me speak to a few of those. First of all, and you mentioned earlier global organizations, and even those organizations that have just operations in the United States. First and foremost, I would say employers need to know what data you have, who can access that data, and why. And that's one takeaway, because I think it kind of falls into the same, general due diligence that you need to put in place. What data do you have? Who can access the data, and why? Why do you have the data, and why does that individual or that department or what have you need to access that data? And that, Natalie, goes towards the concept that's throughout all of these different laws, even dating back to the EU, is this concept of data minimization. Only maintain the amount of data that you truly need. This is one of those instances with these laws where nice to have is not really the best way to think about it. It's what must you have,
right?
In terms of the concept of data minimization. The second and kind of related takeaway, I would say, is when you know what kind of data you have, you'll better be able to identify which laws apply to you. Right now, it's really kind of a patchwork, right? We in the U.S., we've been so used to HIPAA, we've been used to the financial sector. It's more industry or sector specific governance of data. The state laws that are coming to pass now are much more overarching in nature, and so there's a little bit of common ground that's coming to pass with these state laws. But by knowing that what data you have, you'll be better able to identify as an organization which laws you must comply with. And then third and finally, I would say these laws, there's a lot of commonality, but there's a lot of differences. There's many different common requirements, though, for employers, including requirements to have certain data privacy policies. There are certain notice requirements that employees, or these laws define employees in this context as data subjects. And there's notice requirements that an employer needs to make sure that they are about 7 or different 8 kinds of notice rights of these employees that they need to be notified about. There's contractual requirements. If you're sharing data, either within your organization to different entities in different countries or states, or to third parties who are helping you manage HR practices, there's contractual requirements where you need to have certain commitments from both your internal data receivers or third parties in terms of the obligations that they're going to put in place and the security measures. So again, the third one is there's policy requirements, there's notice requirements, there's contractual requirements, and it's important for HR practitioners to know what all these requirements are and to be able to answer questions from employees that might come forward.
Yeah, definitely. Let's talk a little bit about, let's say, back at the Texas Data and Privacy Secrecy Act. So let's say we have an employer that has greater than 500 that is in Houston. What would be a typical violation? And what would be, who is the entity that actually would enforce this? Can you talk to that a little bit so that the employers understand the consequences, let's say, particularly in Texas, of not complying?
Absolutely. So I think the typical violations we need to think about would be, as I mentioned earlier, first and foremost, making sure that your organization has policies. They're communicating what their rights are, where their information can be found, how they can access that information, what they want to do or who they can contact if there's a need for correction or if they want to delete certain information. So all of these rights that employees have, I think that's typically where the enforcement may come. It's a little hard to predict, right? It'll start in July of 2024. The enforcement arm for Texas and most of the states, with the exception of California, but for the most of the states, is the Attorney General. And so the Attorney General has the enforcement responsibilities. And in terms of the violations, it can be up to $7,500 per violation.
Oh.
Now, Texas does not have. California at this point, and Illinois with their Biometric Act. Illinois has a Biometric Data Privacy Act. Both of those states are unique in that they have a private right of action. Texas does not, and most of the other states do not. So it's all going to be through the Attorney General.
Okay.
But the enforcement mechanism that Texas has, and it's about $7,500 per violation.
See, I told you, my listening audience, I told you he was the expert. So he's the guy who can help you understand the do's and the don'ts here, and also what's going to happen to you if you do the don'ts. All right. Super. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today on a really, really broad topic, but you did a great job of just really paring it down for us. So with that said, let's kind of talk at the kind of final segment here of our show with, some best practices for minimizing risk. So certainly key things we talked about is ensuring that we understand the policies that we need to have in place, the specific notice requirements and contractual requirements. So any other key best practices that you think is important for HR professionals to know before we wrap up?
Sure. Thanks, Natalie. So I think I can't stress enough the importance of this concept of data minimization. We live in an age where we want more data, and arguably, we have access to so much data out there, whether it's in the employment context or what have you. But I really urge your organizations, as one of the key best practices, is to look at the data that you have, as I mentioned earlier, really minimize it and cull it down. Because if you think about it, unfortunately, it's a matter of when and not if, as an organization, you might suffer a data breach. We didn't even talk about data breach because all 50 states have data breach laws, right? And so if you minimize the amount of data to really what you truly must have to run your organization, I think that's a key best practice. A second would be, and it sounds simple, but I've worked in many global organizations, as I'm sure many of your listeners have, and it sounds simple, but I would say identify those in the organization that have access to your data, internal or external. You might have third parties that are helping you manage certain things, whether they're IT or benefits providers, what have you, and train them on the key parameters and expectations you have as an organization for maintaining security over the data, and then incorporate training that's unique to your organization or customized to your organization in terms of data privacy laws that apply. I would say that's also, and then third and finally, as we didn't really cover it in too much detail, but data breach is to have a fresh look at your data breach notification plan. If you suffer a data breach, if you suffer a ransomware attack, whatever it might be, have that plan in place, dust it off if you haven't looked at it in a while. Make sure that you have the right individuals that are updated in terms of whether the roles or responsibilities or the departments or what have you. Look at that data breach notification plan, make sure it's updated. And I would even encourage organizations, many of whom I work with do this already, but run some practice drills, do some desktop exercises just to, where you have a true test of how this would work in action if it happened.
Yeah, excellent. Very, very sage advice. Well, I really want to thank you, Jason, for being on our show today. And man, I just think that we could probably, hang out over a pitcher of margaritas and talk about this thing for all afternoon. I think that it's a bigger topic than what we could even cover in just a short show. But I really, really want to thank you for joining us. And so with that said, this wraps it up for our Spotlight on Data Privacy. And look forward to seeing you all back here at the HR Investigations Podcast. See ya.
Thanks for joining us today on the HR Investigations Podcast. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share the show with any colleagues who will benefit from our strategies and solutions. For free bonus resources, simply visit hr-investigations.com. And remember, if you'd like some help with improving your investigative skills, or if your organization is in need of an external investigator to help with the case, please get in touch with us. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.